They thought suspending me would break me. But how do you break someone who's already lived her whole life in silence? The night they handed me that paper, I handed the truth to the feds. The next morning, the board froze, the company fell, and my father finally saw me. Not as a problem, but as the consequence. I'm Avery Holt, and this is how silence became my loudest revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Monday mornings at Westbridge Health Tower always felt sterile, like the air itself had been scrubbed clean of emotion. The elevator doors slid open to the top floor, and the moment I stepped into my father's office, I could tell it wasn't a meeting. It was a verdict. The blinds were half-drawn sunlight slicing the room into neat, unforgiving lines. My father, Marcus Holt, sat behind his desk in a gray suit that matched his expression. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "Apologize to your sister," he said, "or you're fired." For a second, the words didn't land. They hung in the air, mechanical and cold. I looked at him, trying to find some trace of hesitation, but there was none. He wasn't angry. He was resolved. I'd seen that look before, when I was 12 and told him his star daughter had cheated on a science fair project, or when I was 23 and refused to sign off on a policy that violated federal regulations. That same detached disappointment, the kind that said, "You've embarrassed me again, Avery." The door opened, and Natalie walked in. My sister, 3 years older, Westbridge's chief growth officer. The face of the company, the golden child. Our donors adored. Her perfume hit the air before she spoke. "It's not personal, Ave," she said, flashing a smile that never reached her eyes. "It's business." Of course it was. Everything was business to Natalie. To my father, too. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if he'd been forced into this. "You've caused enough division," he said. "This, whatever you're trying to prove, has to stop." What I was trying to prove? That the hospital my mother helped build was turning into a machine that valued revenue over patients. That the same sister who smiled for the cameras was signing contracts that rewarded overbilling. But I didn't say any of that. I just looked at him, and in that moment I realized I was tired. Not just tired, but done. "I understand," I said. He blinked, maybe expecting tears, maybe another argument. Instead, he got silence. The kind that unnerves people who thrive on control. Behind him, the city stretched out under gray skies, a reflection of how I felt. Washed out, colorless, but steady. Natalie crossed her arms, smirking. "You always make things harder than they need to be." I wanted to tell her that integrity was supposed to make things hard, that if it felt easy, you were probably doing it wrong. But I didn't. I turned toward the door. As I reached for the handle, my father said softly, "You're making a mistake." I paused, half turning. "Maybe," I said, "but at least it'll be mine." The hallway outside was hushed, the kind of quiet that follows a closed courtroom door. I walked toward the elevator folder, clutched tight against my chest. The stainless steel doors slid shut, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn his approval. The late nights, the reports rewritten a dozen times, the way I always made myself smaller so he could feel in control. That part of me was gone. The elevator descended in silence. My reflection in the mirrored panel looked unfamiliar, older, colder, but freer. The moment the doors opened on the compliance floor, I exhaled slowly and crossed the hallway. My assistant, Maya, looked up from her desk, eyes wide. "You're back early. How did it go?" I stopped beside her, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Cancel the compliance meetings this week," I said, setting the folder on her desk. "I have something I need to take care of." Her expression flickered with concern, but I was already walking away. The hum of fluorescent lights followed me down the corridor. Somewhere above, I could still hear Natalie's laughter echo faintly through the glass floors. A sound I'd grown up beneath and one I no longer cared to rise above. I pressed the elevator button again this time, without hesitation. For the first time, I wasn't going down. I was stepping out. The drive from downtown Portland back to Lake Oswego used to take 30 minutes. But as a child, it always felt longer. Every turn down the tree-lined road brought me closer to a house that never seemed to belong to me as much as it belonged to them. My father and Natalie. The house was large enough for echoes, and most of them were hers. When I was 8, my father would dress in dark suits, Natalie in bright dresses that made her look like she'd stepped out of one of his glossy medical brochures. They went to hospital galas and donor dinners, her hand tucked proudly in his. Mom and I stayed home sitting at the kitchen table under the soft hum of the old ceiling fan. She'd make cocoa and set out her nursing textbooks for me to color in while she worked. You don't have to be loud to be seen, she used to tell me. Some people just need time to notice you. I wanted to believe her. I remember one night vividly. The rain was heavy, the kind that drowned out the sound of the television. Mom and I were on the couch watching an old movie when the garage door opened. My father's voice boomed down the hallway full of praise. She was incredible. Linda. The donors loved her. Natalie twirled in her sparkly shoes, clutching a small silver plaque engraved with her name. Dad caught sight of me and smiled absently. Avery, say goodnight to your sister. Big day tomorrow. Then he disappeared into his study. It wasn't cruelty, it was absence disguised as pride. He just never thought to divide it evenly. In middle school, Natalie became the star of everything. Speech competitions, student council, hospital fundraisers. I liked the quiet corners of the library, where no one asked me to talk, only to think. Numbers made sense. They didn't play favorites. By high school, I was the one fixing our home computer, balancing Mom's tax spreadsheets, organizing everything she didn't have time to finish after long shifts at the clinic. At 17, I entered a state science competition and won first place. The certificate sat on the fridge for a week before it was replaced by a newspaper clipping of Natalie cutting a ribbon at the hospital's new wing, Dad said. Now that's real impact. I nodded, pretending not to care. 10 years later, that pattern hadn't changed. The only thing different was that Mom was gone. When she died in 2021, something in the house shifted. Marcus, my father, couldn't stand silence, so he filled it with Natalie's voice. She moved into Mom's old role at his side, confidant advisor reflection of his ambitions. I tried to keep my distance, throwing myself into compliance work. Data was predictable. Family wasn't. At Westbridge Health, my office was on the compliance floor, neither glamorous nor visible. Natalie's suite upstairs looked out over the city skyline. She'd wave from the elevator sometimes, that polished smile meant for press photos. People noticed which sister held power. When I walked through the corridors, staff greeted me politely but avoided eye contact. No one wanted to be caught choosing sides. They knew whose opinion mattered. I didn't blame them. I'd built those same walls around myself. That morning after leaving my father's office, I spent hours walking the hospital corridors. Every corner carried memories. Mom's laughter echoing near the pediatric wing, the smell of antiseptic and coffee, the sound of sneakers squeaking on tile floors. The place still bore her signature, a framed photo of her in uniform, standing beside the slogan she'd written years ago. Integrity heals. I stopped in front of it. The photo hung at the intersection of 2 hallways where visitors passed on their way to the main atrium. She looked calm, smiling slightly, her nurse's badge tilted. I stared at it long enough that a passing orderly asked, "You okay, Ms. Holt?" I nodded, stepping aside. Integrity. Heals. I whispered the words, feeling them settle, like a weight in my chest. I thought about how often integrity had cost me. Promotions passed over ideas credited to others, the quiet ridicule of being called too rigid. Natalie used to say I didn't know how to play the game. She was right. I never wanted to. As I walked toward the elevator, I passed the marketing department's glass wall. Inside, Natalie stood in front of a camera crew laughing with the communications team. They were filming her next PR segment, something about modern leadership in healthcare. She caught my reflection in the glass, and for a second our eyes met. Her smile didn't falter, but it hardened. Like glass cooling too fast, I kept walking. In the lobby, a nurse approached me hesitantly. "Ms. Holt, I heard what happened this morning. Is it true I didn't answer?" Her face fell and she said softly, "You don't deserve that." When I stepped outside, the Oregon air was crisp, scented with rain and pine. The city buzzed in the distance, but up here, the sound faded into stillness. I stood on the hospital steps looking at the Westbridge sign gleaming under gray skies, and realized I no longer belonged inside. For years I'd believed staying meant loyalty, to my family, to the hospital, to my mother's memory. But maybe loyalty wasn't about staying silent. Maybe it was about knowing when to walk away. A gust of wind lifted my hair, scattering a few leaves across the marble stairs. I took a breath and turned toward the parking garage. Somewhere behind me, Natalie's laughter carried faintly through the revolving doors. I didn't look back. That was the moment the quiet began to change. Rain tapped against the windows of my office, soft but steady like a clock, reminding me how long I'd been sitting in front of the same spreadsheet. The glow from my monitor painted the room in pale blue. Numbers filled the screen. Rows of billing codes, percentages, timestamps. But one phrase in the contract I'd been reviewing kept catching my eye: revenue optimization program. It sounded harmless, the kind of corporate jargon meant to impress investors. But in compliance work, words like that were red flags dressed as strategy. I scrolled down through the legal attachments, pages of performance incentives, reimbursement clauses, and procedural benchmarks. It was all perfectly polished and dangerously vague. The contract was between Westbridge Health and Horizon InsureCare, Natalie's latest partnership. It promised streamlined billing efficiencies and enhanced revenue consistency. Those phrases should have been meaningless. Yet, as I cross-checked the corresponding data in our internal dashboard, the patterns began to form. Length of patient stays had spiked. So had diagnostic imaging orders. Some codes that were rarely used before now appeared dozens of times in a week. I ran the query again, thinking maybe it was an error in extraction. It wasn't. The numbers lined up too cleanly to be accidental. A knock broke the rhythm of my typing. Dr. Maya Benson stood at the door, her white coat damp from the rain. She looked around, lowered her voice. "Avery, do you have a minute?" She closed the door behind her. "Something's off," she said. "They're pushing unnecessary tests. The residents are worried we're over-ordering just to meet quotas." "Who's they?" I asked. Maya hesitated. "Administration. It came down through Natalie's office. There was an email about optimizing diagnostic throughput." The tone was strange. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Do you still have that email?" She shook her head. "They told us to delete it after reading." I leaned back in my chair. Of course they did. 2 residents appeared later that afternoon, barely out of their 20s, their faces pale. One of them, Jacob said quietly, "We're being told to order MRIs for every chest pain case, even when the EKG's normal." "It doesn't make sense," the other added. "Our attending said it's part of the new initiative. Something about showing stronger diagnostic metrics." They looked terrified. I told them to document everything, then sent them back to their rounds. When the door closed, I turned to my computer again. The pattern was undeniable now. Billing codes for high-severity cases had jumped 37% in just 3 months. I printed out the data sheets, the sound of the machine cutting through the silence. On the last page, I wrote in pen, "Numbers don't lie. People do." The air in my office felt heavier. I wasn't just looking at inflated numbers. I was staring at intent. Someone had built this system deliberately. I pulled the Horizon contract up again, searching for language that could have allowed this. There it was, buried in a footnote at the bottom of page 47. Participating facilities are encouraged to adopt flexible coding practices in accordance with revenue performance goals. Flexible, such a convenient word. Before I could process what to do next, another knock came. Olivia Price, one of the billing analysts, hovered in the doorway, clutching a manila folder. Her eyes darted up and down the hall. "Can I come in?" I gestured for her to close the door. She set the folder on my desk but didn't sit. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "But you should see this." Inside were printed emails, threads from the finance department marked internal use only. The subject line read, "Revenue Flexibility Guidelines." My chest tightened as I skimmed them. Lines of instruction couched in corporate fluff. Ensure revenue capture aligns with projected targets. Apply discretionary interpretation where appropriate. There was a name at the bottom of the last email. Natalie Holt, Chief Growth Officer. Olivia swallowed hard. I saved those before they wiped the inbox. It said they were archiving, but I saw the purge notice go through. I stared at the pages spread across my desk. The neat signatures, the timestamps, my sister's handwriting, digital now, but still unmistakable. "You understand what this means?" I said quietly. She nodded, eyes wet. "It means if anyone outside finds out, we're all complicit." I closed the folder slowly. The rain had grown louder, thrumming against the glass like a second heartbeat. I turned off the desk lamp. The screen glow was enough. "Thank you, Olivia." You didn't see me tonight, and you never printed this. She hesitated, then whispered, What are you going to do? I looked down at the emails, the contract, the pile of data sheets. My mother's voice echoed somewhere deep inside me. Integrity heals. I don't know yet, I said. But whatever it is, it won't stay quiet. When Olivia left, I sat alone, the office now completely dark except for the monitor's glow. I ran my fingers across the word flexibility on the page, tracing it like a wound that refused to close. The storm outside had turned violent thunder rolling across the city. Inside, I knew something had already broken, and there was no going back to the way things were. The IT wing of Westbridge was always cold after hours, the kind of sterile chill that kept servers happy but froze everything human. The lights hummed above rows of black towers, tiny green LEDs blinking like restless eyes. Sam Walker sat hunched over his monitor sleeves, rolled up one headphone in the other, dangling as he typed command lines, faster than I could read them. "Look at this," he said, scrolling through an endless stream of code. Someone accessed the admin console at 2:03 Saturday, full root privileges, deleted over 200 emails from the compliance archive. 2 in the morning, I asked, who even has that level of access? He didn't look up. Only a handful of execs. You, Marcus, and Natalie. The name hung there. I glanced at the timestamp again. 2 a.m. on Saturday. The same night Natalie had texted me a photo from her office. Some late-night marketing prep she'd said #WorkNeverSleeps. She was in the building, I murmured. Sam leaned back, rubbing his eyes. You think she's covering her tracks? I think she's trying to bury something that can't stay buried, I said. Keep pulling. The sound of his keyboard filled the silence. The logs scrolled by lines of time-stamped commands. Data purges, file renames. Each entry was another fingerprint. An alert popped on my phone, a forwarded message from my father. Investor Gregory Shaw had emailed him directly demanding a detailed revenue milestone update within 48 hours. The tone wasn't polite. It was pressure. The kind that trickled down. That's when it hit me. This wasn't sloppiness or greed. It was orchestration. Every department had been steered to inflate numbers to meet targets set by people who would never touch a patient chart. A system doesn't collapse because of bad code. It collapses because people who know better decide silence is easier. While Sam kept working, I checked my messages. One unread text from Dr. Maya Benson blinked on the screen. A patient just filed a complaint. Double charged for the same procedure. She's in outpatient billing now. You might want to hear her story yourself. I left the IT room and took the elevator down my reflection in the mirrored doors, pale and drawn. The billing office was quiet, except for the faint buzz of printers. A middle-aged woman sat at the counter holding a folder in both hands. She looked exhausted. Mrs. Callahan? I asked. She turned surprised. Yes. Are you from billing compliance? I said. Tell me what happened. She opened the folder. Her fingers trembling. They charged me twice for the same MRI. I sold my car to pay it off because they said insurance wouldn't cover it. But I called my insurer. They said the hospital coded it as 2 separate procedures. Her voice cracked on the last word. I took the papers, scanning the claim forms, the line items in black ink, 2 codes, identical dates, 1 patient ID. I'll make sure this gets fixed, I told her. She looked at me like she wanted to believe it, but couldn't afford to. You work for them, she said softly. I've learned what that means. The words hit harder than she knew. I gave her my card anyway, and walked out into the rain-soaked parking lot gripping the file. I'd spent my whole career defending the idea that ethics could survive inside profit. Maybe I'd been wrong. Back upstairs, Sam was still at the terminal, eyes wide. I think I found what you wanted. He slid a flash drive across the desk, recovered from the backup logs. There's a signature string attached to one of the purge commands. It's not an alias. It's Natalie's unique credential. She authorized the deletion, and she signed off on a directive called Revenue Target Compliance. The room went still. I stared at the screen, her digital signature glowing faintly in the corner, like a confession. You sure this is legit? I asked. 100%? Time-stamped, verified, and tied to her device ID. The server lights blinked in rhythmic pulses, the machines humming like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Sam lowered his voice. You know what this means, right? Once you move on, there's no going back. I exhaled slowly, staring at the screen until the lines blurred. There was never a back to go to, I said. Outside, the storm was gathering again, rain tapping harder against the glass. Somewhere above us in her office lined with framed magazine covers, Natalie was probably celebrating another quarter of growth. But down here, in the cold, fluorescent glow, the truth was starting to take shape. And it carried her name. The clock on my computer read 12:43 m when I stopped typing long enough to notice how cold my coffee had gone. The rest of the office was dark, just the blue glow from my monitor, cutting through the silence. The pile of documents beside me had grown into a fortress. Printed audits, email chains, physicians' statements, billing logs. Screenshots from the Horizon contract. 108 pages in total. I had cross-checked every number twice, then a third time until my eyes burned. The cursor blinked at the end of the last sentence of my executive summary. Systemic manipulation of medical billing codes, resulting in inflated reimbursements and potential insurance fraud. I stared at it for a long moment. I didn't want Westbridge to fall apart. I only wanted my mother's name, the one etched on the plaque in the lobby, not to be dragged through the mud she'd never walk in. She had believed that integrity could heal. I still wanted to believe it too. I attached the report to a single email addressed to my father, the board, and the ethics committee. My hands hovered over the keyboard before I hit send. When the progress bar reached 100%, the quiet in the room deepened like the air itself was holding its breath. By morning, the storm had shifted from rain to thunder. An emergency meeting was called at 9. The boardroom was all glass and gloss, a long table lined with people who had memorized how to look concerned without committing to it. My father sat at the head, Natalie beside him, her makeup flawless, her anger barely hidden. She slammed the printed report onto the table. "You're sabotaging us," she shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This will destroy everything we've built." "I'm not the one who built it that way," I said quietly. Marcus's tone was low-clipped. "You're too emotional, Avery. You've always been like this, blowing small issues into catastrophes." The words stung more than I wanted them to. Emotional. That was always his way of discrediting me. Never right, never wrong, just too emotional. Catherine Hale, the only board member who actually read compliance memos, cleared her throat. "The findings are serious," she began, but Marcus cut her off. "The way she presented them has caused panic. We cannot afford this kind of negativity internally. It undermines confidence." Natalie leaned forward, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're making us look corrupt over a few misunderstood metrics. Do you even know how much pressure I'm under to meet investor demands?" I looked at her, at the perfect shell she had built around herself, and for the first time felt something closer to pity than rage. "Yes," I said. "That's why I checked your numbers first." The room went silent. My father's jaw tightened. He folded his hands. "Here's what's going to happen. You're suspended for 30 days without pay. When you return, you'll submit a written apology to your sister, to the board, acknowledging that your handling of this matter damaged team trust. Then we move forward." I watched him, trying to decide which part of him thought this was leadership and which part thought it was love. Catherine looked down at her notepad. No one else spoke. Something inside me went very still, a kind of quiet I'd only felt once before. The night my mother died, and I realized no one was coming to fix what was broken. I gathered the copies of my report from the table, stacked them neatly, and placed them back into my folder. When I finally looked up, I met my father's eyes. "All right," I said. Natalie blinked, as if waiting for me to beg. When I didn't, her smirk faltered. Marcus exhaled with relief, misreading my calm as surrender. "Good. Let's keep this professional." I turned toward the door. The hallway outside was bright, the sunlight harsh after the heavy air inside. My heels clicked softly on the tile as I walked away from the voices behind the glass. They thought they had disciplined me, neutralized me, filed me away like a minor inconvenience. But what they had actually done was confirm everything in those 108 pages. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel betrayed. I felt free. At my desk, the screensaver reflected the faint outline of my face. For the first time in years, I didn't see the dutiful daughter or the quiet employee trying to prove her worth. I saw someone standing on the edge of something vast, uncertain, and necessary. I packed my folder, slipped my mother's old fountain pen into my pocket, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, they would expect me to return humbled. Instead, they would wake to find the balance finally shifting. Rain misted against my apartment windows, the kind that blurs the streetlights and makes the whole city look half asleep. The clock on the kitchen counter read 10:37 p.m. I hadn't turned on the TV or music, only the sound of drizzle outside and Milo, the neighbor's rescue dog, barking distantly down the hall. It was the kind of quiet that made decisions louder. I pulled the small gray safe from under my bed. It was dusty, heavier than I remembered. The last time I opened it was the week after my mother's funeral, when I couldn't bear to read what she'd left behind. My hands hesitated on the dial, turning each number like it might unlock something more than metal. When the latch finally clicked, the smell of paper and cedar filled the room. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. Steady, curved, certain. Beneath it lay a single document stamped in blue Holt Family Trust. I unfolded the pages slowly. My mother's signature rested beside a notary seal from 5 years ago. I took a breath and opened her letter. Her words were short but deliberate. If Westbridge ever loses the soul we built it on, you have the right and the responsibility to protect it. Not for your father, not for me, for the people who depend on it. Integrity heals, Avery. Don't let them forget that. My throat tightened. I hadn't cried for months, not since the night of the boardroom suspension, but something about her voice, even on paper, cracked the shell I'd built around myself. I called my Aunt Rachel Dunn, who lived up in Seattle. She picked up on the second ring. Avery. It's late, sweetheart. Is everything all right? I stared at the trust papers on the table. Did Mom ever tell you about this? There was a long pause, then a sigh. She told me she set something aside under your name. 23% of the company shares voting control attached. It was to make sure you could act if things ever went wrong. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. There's a clause. It activates if the CEO or CGO is under investigation for ethical violations. That's them. Rachel's tone softened, but her words were firm. Then it's time you do what she prepared you for. When we hung up, the apartment felt impossibly still. The city hum was just a distant hum under the rain. I opened my laptop, the screen lighting the room with cold blue. My cursor hovered over the folder that held everything. Sam's recovered server logs, Olivia's emails, the data spreadsheets, patient statements, the compliance report. My phone buzzed twice. A message from Sam, backup, ready. Logs verified. If you're really doing this, do it now before they lock your access. Another from Olivia. You're not alone in this. Send it. I rested my fingers on the keyboard, my pulse quick under my skin. For years I'd told myself silence was survival, but silence had only made me complicit. I opened the federal whistleblower portal. The form stared back, sterile and bureaucratic. I filled in every field, every date, every contact. My mother's words whispered at the edge of my mind. Integrity heals. When it asked for attachments, I selected the folder. The progress bar crawled slowly across the screen. 1%, 7%, 21%. I sat there breathing through the fear. Somewhere between 80% and 99%, a kind of calm took over. The moment it hit 100%, a small gray box appeared. Submission complete. Federal portal reference number 4216P. For a second, I couldn't move. Then I exhaled the breath shaking out of me, like a release I hadn't known I needed. It was done. I printed my resignation letter on thick paper, signed it, and slipped it into a plain envelope. Then I packed my office key's ID badge and a photo of my mother and me from the old Westbridge clinic, the one before the marble floors and PR teams. By the time I drove to the hospital, the streets were slick and empty. Security lights cast long reflections across the glass facade. I parked, walked through the staff entrance, and made my way to my office one last time. The room looked smaller than I remembered. I gathered my notebooks, the framed quote from my mother. Do what's right, not what's easy, and placed the resignation letter on my desk. The printer light blinked once before fading into black. I turned off the lamp, letting the monitors glow for a few seconds longer. Then I shut everything down one by one until the only thing left was my reflection in the window. Tired, calm, resolute. When I stepped into the hallway, the motion sensor lights flickered on behind me, then dimmed again as I walked away. Outside, the drizzle had stopped. The city was quiet. I locked the door, the metallic click echoing in the empty corridor. For the first time, I didn't look back. By 7 the next morning, the upper floor of Westbridge Health buzzed with its usual polished energy. The glass hallways gleamed, the scent of fresh coffee drifted through, and Natalie's heels clicked sharply against the marble as she strode in, phone in hand, coat bright against the muted decor. She hummed as she passed reception. To her, this was victory. She had survived another one of my meltdowns, and by now she was sure I'd be back soon, humbled, apologetic, eager to keep my position. The receptionist, a young admin named Claire, greeted her nervously. "Good morning, Ms. Holt. Just so you know, Ms. Avery's badge isn't active in the system anymore." Natalie smirked, tossing her coat over the back of her chair as she walked into her office. "Guess she finally learned her place," she said lightly, pulling a lipstick from her bag. She was mid-sentence when the elevator doors banged open down the hall. Ethan Cole. The company's general counsel came rushing out. Shirt untucked, tie loose, phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale, his breathing quick. "Tell me she didn't post it," he muttered, voice cracking. Natalie frowned. "Post what?" Ethan's gaze darted to her, the panic in his eyes unmistakable. "The report," he said. "The federal portal. Please tell me Avery didn't submit it." Natalie laughed, confused. "You're overreacting. She's suspended, not stupid," but Ethan was already moving past her down the hall toward my office. Marcus appeared from his own sweet expression, taut with irritation. "Ethan, what the hell is going on?" Ethan didn't answer. He stopped in front of my office door, which stood slightly ajar. Inside, the lights were off. The desk was spotless. No papers, no computer, just a single envelope in the center of the polished wood. "Where is she?" Marcus demanded. Ethan didn't respond. He stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and broke the seal. The paper inside was neatly folded. His hands trembled as he read aloud. "Effective immediately. I hereby resign from my position as Director of Compliance and Risk. All supporting documentation and audit materials have been submitted to the Office of Inspector General for federal review." The room went silent. Marcus stared at him, uncomprehending. "She wouldn't." "She did," Ethan said quietly. He sank into the nearest chair, pulling his phone back up as if hoping reality might change. His fingers shook as he scrolled, eyes widening. "Oh my God," he whispered. "She attached the full documentation. The Horizon contract, the revenue metrics, internal communications. She sent everything." Natalie's face drained of color. "You're kidding." Before Ethan could answer, Marcus stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. His eyes landed on the digital acknowledgement at the bottom of the screen. "Submission received, Office of Inspector General, case reference number 4216P. A notification tone suddenly broke the silence. A crisp ding from the wall-mounted conference display down the corridor. Then another and another. The sounds spread through the floor like dominoes falling. Phones, tablets, laptops, every connected device in the executive suite pinged almost simultaneously. Ethan turned toward the noise, his face ashen. "That's the OIG acknowledgement email," he said softly. "They've confirmed receipt." The words hit Marcus like a blow. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of my empty desk. "Do you understand what she's done?" he hissed at Natalie. "She's brought federal oversight into our house." Natalie stumbled back, shaking her head. She wouldn't risk that much. "Dad, she wouldn't destroy everything." Ethan's phone buzzed again. He looked down, eyes wide. "There's more. The independent board members just called an emergency meeting. They want clarification on a pending federal inquiry." "And, Marcus, they copied you." Marcus didn't speak. He stared at the resignation letter still resting on the desk, his reflection fractured in the glass surface. For the first time since I was a child, he looked small, like the weight of the empire he'd built had finally turned against him. Natalie's voice was barely a whisper. "She planned this." Ethan nodded once. Every step. The chime from his phone sounded again, followed by another from the hallway, then another. It was like the building itself had started to hum with the sound of consequences. Ethan's voice trembled when he read the subject line of the new message. "Acknowledged receipt of whistleblower submission, Westbridge Health Network," he said. "It's official. The investigation's live." For a long moment, no one moved. Marcus stood rooted in place, staring at the empty office. Natalie's eyes glistened, fury and disbelief twisting her expression. Ethan just sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead with both hands. Upstairs in my apartment across the river, the morning light finally broke through the clouds. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the city humming softly beyond the window. My inbox pinged with the same message Ethan had just read. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply exhaled and let the sound of the rain fade into quiet. The boardroom felt different that afternoon, stripped bare, all the polished edges dulled by the weight of what was coming. No bottled water, no floral centerpieces, no friendly chatter about quarterly growth. Just silence and the smell of tension sharp like disinfectant. Catherine Hale sat at the head of the table, posture straight, reading glasses low on her nose. She looked every bit the woman who had built hospitals before people like Natalie learned to pose for them. "We're here to discuss the federal submission and internal misconduct at Westbridge Health," she began. Her tone wasn't angry. It was final. Marcus sat to her right, hands clasped, jaw tight. Natalie was next to him, her shoulders square but her fingers trembling against the folder in front of her. I watched them from the doorway for a long second before stepping inside. All heads turned as I entered. I wasn't wearing a Westbridge badge anymore. No corporate pin, no nameplate clipped to my jacket. I didn't need one. Marcus's face hardened. "She's no longer part of this company," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Catherine didn't look at him. "She's part of this board now." The words hit the table like a gavel. Marcus blinked. "What are you talking about?" I set a binder down and slid a single page across to her. The Holt Family Trust. My mother established it to safeguard Westbridge's ethical integrity. It includes a 23% voting share, activated under federal investigation. Catherine nodded slowly, verifying the document. Her voting rights are valid. The room shifted. Even the air seemed to pause. Marcus's composure cracked. "You had no right to bring family business into this." "This isn't family business," I said. "It's public trust. You turned it into a profit machine, Dad. I'm just turning the lights back on." He looked at me with something between fury and disbelief. Natalie, on the other hand, looked pale, like she finally realized the cameras weren't on her this time. Catherine gestured toward the screen at the end of the table. "Ms. Holt, you may present your findings." I opened my laptop and mirrored the display. The first slide came up a timeline of internal communications, followed by data graphs of inflated billing codes. My voice didn't shake. "These are internal revenue reports cross-referenced with deleted email logs. The admin credentials used belong to the Chief Growth Officer. The next slide showed recovered commands from the IT logs. Here is the deletion record from the Compliance Archive, time-stamped and verified. Sam Walker. Our forensic specialist confirmed these files were purged at 2:03 a.m. from Ms. Natalie Holt's terminal." Natalie's lips parted. "That's not..." Next, I continued, not looking at her. Email directives encouraging flexible coding tied to performance bonuses. I have statements from billing staff confirming they were pressured to overcode procedures. Catherine glanced toward the far end of the room. "Dr. Benson, you were one of those who came forward." Maya nodded, voice steady. "Yes, we were told to increase testing even when not clinically necessary. It was presented as a growth initiative." Across the table, Natalie's hand tightened around her pen. "We were optimizing for patient outcomes." "No." Maya interrupted, her tone clipped. "You were optimizing revenue. You asked us to do things that could hurt patients." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Catherine turned toward the video monitor, where Gregory Shaw's face appeared from his Denver office. His tone was ice cold. "Marcus, did you know about this?" My father shifted in his chair. "Gregory, these are exaggerations, misunderstandings being spun out of proportion by someone with personal grievances." Gregory leaned closer to the camera. "You hid an active compliance breach from your investors. That's not a misunderstanding." The sound of the rain outside filled the room again, steady and unrelenting. I looked at my father. "I didn't destroy Westbridge. I stopped it from destroying everyone else." He slammed a hand on the table, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "You've humiliated this family, Avery. Your mother would never have done this." I met his eyes. "She's the reason I did." Catherine adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "I think we've heard enough." She opened a thin folder, removed a typed document, and read aloud. "Effective immediately, Dr. Marcus Holt and Ms. Natalie Holt are suspended from all executive functions pending an independent investigation. The audit committee will assume interim control." The words seemed to drain the color from the room. Natalie shot to her feet, voice shaking. "You can't do this." Catherine didn't blink. "We just did." Marcus sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing, with no sound. I gathered my papers, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a strange, quiet clarity. The storm outside had found its echo in here. As I walked out, the automatic doors slid open, and the cool air from the hallway hit my face. Behind me, the room erupted, voices rising, papers shuffling, phones buzzing. But for the first time, none of it belonged to me. A week later, Westbridge no longer felt like the same company. The lobby that once smelled of polished marble and money now reeked of panic. Conversations stopped when elevators opened. Employees huddled in corners, whispering about subpoenas, deleted emails, and someone from Washington flying in for a review. The front gates were lined with cameras, reporters calling out names as executives tried to sneak through side entrances. The story had broken 3 days earlier. Internal whistleblower exposes fraudulent billing scheme at Westbridge Health. Michael Turner, an investigative journalist out of Seattle, had been digging for months without proof. I had just given him everything he needed. His first article was cautious, quoting unnamed sources citing documents under federal examination. By day 2, it exploded across national outlets. Every morning, news anchor had their version of the same phrase. Corporate greed, compliance failure, whistleblower retaliation. My name wasn't printed yet, but inside the hospital, everyone already knew. Ethan Cole, the company's general counsel, called me that Thursday evening. "They're circling," he said quietly. CMS just opened a full audit. The Office of Inspector General confirmed an active federal review. The board's law firm wants to question you formally. "Will you represent me?" I asked. He hesitated. "I can't. Conflict of interest. But—" He lowered his voice. "I sent the auditors the server backup." Sam recovered. It was the right thing to do. "Just be careful. They'll look for someone to blame before they look for the truth." I thanked him. His loyalty wasn't to me anymore, but at least it wasn't to the lie either. By Friday, the chaos had spread beyond the glass walls of Westbridge Tower. Patients began demanding refunds. Local news vans camped outside the parking garage. Natalie's face appeared on television more times in one day than it ever had during her media tours. Only now the chyron read "Executive under federal review," an email she'd written. The same one that said, "Be flexible with coding to protect revenue flows," was quoted word for word on morning talk shows. The networks blurred her name, but everyone recognized the phrasing. Marcus stopped showing up to the office. I heard from Olivia that his assistant had packed his things late at night, escorted out by security. Investors were pulling funding faster than finance could calculate the losses. That afternoon, Natalie called him. The call was recorded, voicemail leaked later, but at the time, only a few of us knew. Her voice was raw, unsteady. "Dad, please fix this. You always fix it." And then his answer tired and hoarse. "I can't. For all the times he had preached control legacy order, that single sentence was the truest thing he'd ever said." Gregory Shaw, the investor who once called Westbridge a model of modern healthcare, divested his entire portfolio overnight. Stock prices fell 23% before the market closed. Reporters swarmed the building. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with me now sent cautious texts, some thanking me, others begging for updates. The hallways buzzed with fear, anger, disbelief. Compliance officers from other hospitals reached out privately to say, "You did what we all wish we could." I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, I felt tired. The truth was heavy, even when it finally stood on its own. I drove to the Westbridge campus late that evening, parking across the street. From my car, I could see the top floors where Natalie used to film her interviews, where my father once held court like a king over his domain. Now the windows were dark blinds drawn. The logo, that once glowed gold at night, flickered half the letters unlit. I sat there for a long time, the engine off, watching the reflection of red and blue police lights bouncing against the glass as auditors boxed up files inside. The same building that had defined my childhood, my career, my worth. It was collapsing in real time, piece by piece. The notification came through my email at 8:02 p.m., Office of Inspector General. Formal notice of investigation, Westbridge Health Network. Allegations of systemic fraud, billing manipulation, and ethical breach are under federal review. The message was polite, bureaucratic, and absolute. I closed my laptop, looking out at the silhouette of the hospital against the dark Portland sky. It used to feel like home. Now it was just a monument to what happens when ambition outruns decency. The rain started again, faint and persistent, blurring the view through my windshield. I pressed my hand to the steering wheel, breathing through the quiet. I wasn't happy they'd fallen. I wasn't even relieved. I was just finally free of pretending it couldn't happen. The sky over Portland was the color of ash, heavy and still. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still carried that damp chill that clung to everything. I heard the knock before I saw his shadow move across the frosted glass of my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. Marcus stood there, hands deep in his coat pockets, hair more gray than I remembered. He looked smaller somehow, not shorter, just reduced like something inside him had been hollowed out. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "May I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He walked into my apartment, eyes scanning the small space. It wasn't much. A couch, a shelf of books, a few framed photos. The view of the Willamette River through wide windows. No marble, no art, no trophies. Just quiet. He turned slowly, taking it all in. "You really left it all behind," he said. "I had to," I replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You destroyed what we built." I met his eyes. "No, Dad. I saved what was left." The silence that followed was thick, like the air itself didn't want to move. He took a deep breath and sat down on the couch without waiting for permission. I stayed standing, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. He stared at the floor. "Do you have any idea what's happened?" "The board sold off half our assets. Gregory pulled every cent of his investment. Your sister, she's not even taking calls. I know," I said. He looked up sharply. "And that doesn't bother you? Watching everything fall apart?" "It wasn't mine to keep together," I said. "It stopped being ours a long time ago." His jaw flexed, that familiar sign he was holding something back. "You could have come to me. We could have fixed this quietly." I shook my head. Quiet is what let it rot in the first place. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, looking out at the river. The reflection of the gray water flickered across his face. "You think this was easy for me, running a company, losing your mother, trying to keep this family intact?" I cut in softly. "You didn't keep it intact. You just ignored the cracks and hoped no one would notice." He turned back, his voice sharp. "You've always judged me. You have no idea what it's like to carry all of it." "Maybe not," I said, "but I know what it's like to be invisible in your shadow." That stopped him. The air went quiet again. I thought about Mrs. Callahan, her trembling hands clutching those billing forms. I thought about the nurses who'd whispered their fears to me in hallways, the residents who'd looked terrified just to speak the truth. He finally sat again, his shoulders slumped. The anger drained out of him, leaving something raw behind. "I kept choosing Natalie because she needed me," he said quietly. "You didn't." For a long time I didn't respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of honesty that comes too late. "I didn't need you to fix things for me," I said. "I just needed you to see me. Once." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening, but dry. "I see you now." Something in his voice cracked on the last word, and for a second I saw not the CEO, not the man who built an empire, but just a father who finally realized what he'd broken. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I thought if I kept the company alive, I could keep her alive too," he whispered. "Your mother. Everything she built. Everything she was." I swallowed, the ache rising in my throat. "Mom would have hated what it became." "I know." His voice was barely audible. "She'd have sided with you." We sat in silence, the river moving slowly beyond the window, the sky fading toward dusk. For the first time in years, there was no argument left between us, only exhaustion and the quiet understanding that nothing could go back to what it was. He stood to leave. At the door, he turned one hand on the knob. "Timadian, I'm sorry," he said. "For a lot of things I didn't see until too late." I nodded. "Me too." When he walked out the door, closed softly behind him. I stood there a while longer, watching his figure blur through the mist as he crossed the parking lot. It struck me then. The real collapse hadn't happened in the boardroom or the headlines. It was happening here quietly in the space where a father and daughter finally ran out of things to protect. 6 months later, the world had quieted. The headlines faded, the reporters moved on, and Westbridge became just another case study in how ambition outpaces ethics. The company still stood, but it looked nothing like what it used to be. The gleaming gold W that once crowned the Portland skyline was gone, replaced by a muted blue logo and a tagline about transparency and community care. There were no grand opening ceremonies, no glossy marketing campaigns. The new leadership seemed to understand that rebuilding trust wasn't about noise. They created a new compliance division independent from the executive floor. For the first time, the department had its own line of reporting separate from revenue oversight. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Sam sent me a photo of the new plaque outside their office, Compliance and Patient Ethics, established 2026. Underneath a small note read, "Integrity heals." I stared at that picture for a long time thinking about Mom. Natalie had moved to Arizona by then. Her new real estate firm's website featured her smiling in bright desert sunlight hair perfectly curled, her bio full of words like visionary, driven, passionate about helping people find their dream homes. I scrolled through her Instagram once, a carefully curated life of sunsets, open houses, champagne toasts. Her eyes were still the same, though. The camera never hid emptiness. My father had been reassigned to a clinic on the outskirts of Salem. Community medical advisor, the title read. A ceremonial role, really. Enough to keep him employed, but far from the empire he'd once commanded. He called every few weeks, his voice gentler now, slower. He talked about seeing a dozen patients a day, about how strange it felt to work without a boardroom. I never asked if he missed it. Some questions don't need answers. As for me, I moved north to Seattle and joined Northwest Community Health Systems as Director of Ethics and Compliance. The office was small, a converted floor in an old brick building with mismatched chairs and coffee that always tasted burnt, but it was honest. People smiled because they wanted to, not because they were being watched. My team was 5 people, and on my first day they handed me a mug that said, "Do what's right, not what's easy." I didn't tell them that line had belonged to my mother. Most mornings followed the same rhythm. I'd wake to sunlight filtering through the blinds. Milo curled up by the window, his head resting on his paws. I'd brew coffee, open the window to let in the sound of gulls and fairy horns, and watch the city come alive below. For the first time in years, I didn't brace myself before checking my inbox. One morning in early spring, I received a thick envelope addressed in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter from Mrs. Callahan. She thanked me for what I'd done, though she never used the word whistleblower. She said she'd been reimbursed for the double charge, and that her husband's physical therapy was finally covered. "You didn't just help me," she wrote. "You reminded me that honesty can still matter." I read that line twice before setting the letter on my desk. Later that week, an email popped up from Ethan Cole. The subject line read, "Starting over." He'd left Westbridge, too, and was joining a non-profit legal foundation in Denver that helped healthcare whistleblowers navigate retaliation cases. His message ended simply. It's strange, isn't it? Freedom feels quieter than I expected. I smiled when I read it. He was right. Freedom wasn't loud. It was the absence of noise. By May, the cherry blossoms outside my office window had fallen, and the air carried that early summer warmth that made Seattle smell faintly of salt and rain. Work was busy, but not consuming. I'd walk to the farmer's market on weekends, buy flowers I never used to have time for, and sit on my porch with Milo while the sun went down over the water. That morning, my inbox chimed again. The subject line read, "Integrity and Courage, Seattle Health Ethics Conference." They were inviting me to speak. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. The last time I'd stood in front of a crowd to talk about integrity, I'd been accused of destroying a legacy. Now they were asking me to teach others how to preserve one. I leaned back in my chair, the light spilling across the desk. Milo stretched at my feet, tail thumping lazily against the floor. I typed 2 words. "I'll be there." Then I hit send and let the quiet settle again. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the kind that comes when something inside you finally rests. The conference hall in downtown Seattle was brighter than I expected. Rows of white chairs faced the stage, and behind the podium, a large screen displayed my opening slide, "Rebuilding Ethics from Within." The words looked cleaner, stronger than they had on my laptop the night before. Outside, the air carried that early autumn chill, enough to make the glass windows fog slightly as the room filled with people. When the moderator introduced me, I walked to the stage with my notes in hand, but didn't look down. I didn't need to. The story was already carved into me. I started with what they already knew: the headlines, the investigation, the collapse of a once golden institution. But then I told them what they didn't know. I told them about a family dinner in Lake Oswego, where my father congratulated my sister for closing a sponsorship deal, while I quietly celebrated my scholarship in silence. About the first time I realized integrity could make you invisible. About the moment I decided I'd rather be unseen and right than visible and complicit. The room stayed silent. No one checked their phones, no one whispered. I spoke about my mother's trust, about her belief that compassion and compliance weren't opposites, but twins. That good medicine starts with conscience, not ambition. When I finished, I looked up at the last line on the slide integrity heals. My mother's handwriting copied from an old note she once left in my textbook. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone in the second row stood and began clapping. Within seconds, the entire hall followed. The sound swelled and echoed off the walls, louder than anything I'd heard at Westbridge's award galas, but purer. I didn't cry. I just smiled and let the sound wash over me. When the applause faded, I stepped down from the stage. In the front row, my Aunt Rachel rose to hug me. She'd be so proud, she whispered. Across the hall near the exit, I saw him. Marcus stood by the doorway, coat draped over his arm, watching. He looked older, slower, but the anger was gone from his face. Our eyes met. He nodded once. I nodded back. It was enough. Words would have ruined it. Afterward, people came to shake my hand to ask questions about ethics programs and whistleblower protections. I answered what I could, but part of me was already outside, standing under the clear blue Seattle sky. The city sounded alive. Cars, ferries, snippets of laughter carried by the wind. I sat on the steps of the conference center, set my notes down beside me, and closed my eyes for a moment. It struck me then how far as that word all right had carried me. The day I said it to my father, it meant surrender. Now, it meant release. They said apologize or lose everything. I said all right. Turns out everything I lost was exactly what I needed to let go. I opened my eyes, sunlight catching the edge of the glass buildings across the street. The wind picked up, scattering a few yellow leaves along the steps. Milo would be waiting for me at home, tail thumping against the floor, eyes full of the kind of loyalty that doesn't need to be earned. I gathered my notes and walked down toward the street, where the hum of the city blended with the calm inside me. The story was done, but the lesson lingered. Quiet, steady, alive. If you've ever been told to stay silent just to keep the peace, remember this: justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to stand alone that makes the loudest sound. And if my story found you stay a while, there are more stories like this, about truth, about courage, about the moments when doing what's right costs everything but gives you back yourself. Because sometimes the loudest revenge isn't noise, it's peace.